Hello and welcome to another edition of TPA Talks. Today's guest will probably be known to many of you. He's a former MEP, he's a Daily Telegraph journalist, he's president of the Institute for Free Trade, and he's a friend of the Taxpayers Alliance. It's Dan Hannan. Hello, Dan. Welcome to TPA Talks. How are you?
It's great to be with you, Harry, and thank you for everything the TPA does. Especially valuable at a time like this when no one else cares about the basic principles of fiscal sanity.
We'll come on to the sort of economic side of things later, but I want to start with the BBC licence fee. We've got a campaign called Axe the Tax. We've just heard recently that over 75s and now about 3 million are going to be charged for having a TV licence. You've written extensively about the BBC. Why is it that the BBC still clings to the licence fee model, despite the amount of people that are increasingly dead set against it?
I think it's what Milton Friedman would have called the tyranny of the status quo. Nobody would suggest this model if we were inventing it today. The licence fee model makes sense when you have one broadcaster for the entire country, which is what we had when the BBC was established. It's been actually, I would say, redundant ever since there were rival TV companies, but it's become utterly indefensible in an age of Netflix and YouTube and streaming of various kinds. And I think that's the really key argument. And it's an argument I think that a number of people in the BBC are beginning privately to acknowledge. That there's a great temptation in politics to deploy arguments that make your side feel warm, but that may not be the most persuasive. So there is a very good tactical argument, for example, that says if we're interested as a conservative government in blue-collar conservatism, in holding those red wall seats, then reducing this tax is a measure that would make a tangible difference to people in a way that, wealth taxes or whatever wouldn't. I get that, but that's not really the reason to do it. There's an argument that says the BBC is biased, and it's biased partly because of the way it's funded, and it's become more overtly biased over the last couple of months in its coverage of these kind of culture war issues. Again, perfectly true, but not the main reason for doing it. The main reason for doing it is that it is, to, I think, anyone under the age of 30, completely incomprehensible that they're having to pay a television poll tax when the vast majority of their viewing is not from the BBC.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how much longer do you think they can go on going down this route? I mean, it's now £157.50 a year. I mean, I've said before, I think if the charge was, say, £50, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. But of course, you what you get now for that £157.50 is a lot different to what it used to be. I mean, I remember the days when you used to have Test match cricket on the BBC, and I think even some Champions League football. But you don't get that anymore. I mean, even Disney are now going into the streaming market. So how much longer can they keep going like this?
It is extraordinary, isn't it? So they're not doing those things, but they're maintaining quite bizarre things like a network of local radio stations. Like, that was something that was being perfectly well catered for by the private sector. There was no market failure there. There was no real justification. It was just sheer sort of empire building. I think that a lot of the BBC's core activities will be commercially viable in any situation. So one of the things that I'm sure you guys at the TPA are struck by whenever you have this argument about ending the licence fee is defenders of the BBC will say, oh, but what about those wonderful Attenborough nature programmes? Or, yeah, great. I mean, I think they're wonderful. We're great fans of them in this household, but there is no universe in which they are not profitable. They're sold all over the world. That's in any situation, that's going to be something that people continue to want to subscribe and watch. And I wouldn't underestimate from the BBC's point of view the extent of, well, again, of Milton Friedman's tyranny of the status quo, right? We're creatures of habit. When telecoms were privatized, most people carried on using BT because they were used to using BT. If the license fee is withdrawn, if the BBC becomes a subscription service like Sky or anyone else, my guess is that a large number of people will continue to subscribe because they're used to watching EastEnders or whatever their bag is. there's no reason to see it as a terrible threat. And I think that the more progressive elements in the BBC have already grasped this.
Interesting. I mean, there was an interview with the chief executive of Channel 4, Alex Mahon, the other day, saying that Channel 4 it's in this weird state, isn't it, where it's sort of not publicly funded, yet it is owned by the public, and it can potentially have a taxpayer subsidy. But she was saying that even despite what's going on at the moment, they're not going to ask for a bailout. And you think, well, why can't the BBC follow this excellent example? I mean, it also raises the question, why do we still have Channel 4 on the book, so to speak? But yeah, it's quite ridiculous. I mean, is there any way the BBC can win back the favour of those that they've lost?
Yes, I think that just like British Airways or British Telecom, they will become much better if they are set free and allowed to do their own thing. And I think, by the way, that argument applies also equally to Channel 4. You're right, it's a weird hybrid situation where they receive indirect support. If Channel 4 were completely on its own and self-financing and have those residual obligations of public interest broadcasting removed, as well as the residual subsidies. So, I mean, there's no reason for them to have to do Channel 4 News, except that they are defined as a public service broadcaster. Let Channel 4 News then be the kind of woke opinion column that it is. There's a place for that on TV, right? But let's stop pretending that it's neutral because it's being in some ways supported by the taxpayer. And I suspect that they would do better. We will all know that we were getting partial opinion, just in the way that you do if you watch CNN or Fox, you know which side it's coming from. I think there's no such thing as objectivity. There's no such thing as pure unbiased, objective broadcasting. What you call objective, I will call subjective, and so on, right? So the best you can do, if you want to have accuracy, is to encourage pluralism, to have a multiplicity of different providers, different interpretations, different stories, and out of that cacophony, out of that din of different interpretations, you will be able to discern something close to the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a point I made on radio once. You know, you have the Mirror, you have the Sun, you have the Guardian, the Telegraph. But ultimately, you're free to choose if you want to buy them or not. And that's, exactly. As you say, that's what the whole thing's about.
Exactly, and because everyone knows that they are not pretending to be impartial, people read them with a cast of mind which is more sceptical than when, not unreasonably, they think that the BBC is giving them unvarnished and unbiased truth, because that is, in theory, what it's obliged to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to the economic side of things, it's obviously been a very tough time for a lot of Brits, and a lot of people have lost jobs or certainly seen their incomes rapidly deplete. We had the Chancellor's mini-budget economic statement, whatever you want to call it, a few days ago. What do you think about his plans to kickstart the economy post-coronavirus?
I am beginning to worry that almost no one, apart from you and me, is still making the case for living within your means. Every bit of coverage of that recent budget was from the same direction. Has Rishi Sunak done enough to save jobs? Every interview of every politician, the politician was pushed from the same direction. But are you spending enough? Are you intervening enough? Shouldn't you be doing more? And, I'm absolutely prepared to accept that in an emergency situation, yes, there is a role for fiscal loosening. Yes, you bring forward some infrastructure projects and so on. But this is not unlimited. We're spending unbelievable sums of money. We've spent more in the last 3 months than in any equivalent period ever, including in the Great Depression in the two world wars. And the sort of insouciance about this, the belief that it'll all get back to normal, I'm afraid is going to leave a lot of people feeling pretty disappointed. I'm afraid our problems are just beginning when the virus passes, because we've got all these stored up economic and fiscal problems. And somebody has to say this. The government cannot create jobs. The government cannot maintain jobs, at least not sustainably. And every government that tries to do so ends up sucking more money out of the productive bit of the economy, distorting decisions. So for every job it creates, it ends up destroying more. For every pound it spends, it ends up, if you like, wasting more that could have been more usefully spent by private citizens or enterprises rather than by civil servants. And I grew up thinking that was basic common sense conservatism. I'm now realizing what a minority opinion that is.
Yeah, I think you might be right. And obviously, we've seen history has shown us that where you have a smaller state, you tend to get a much more flourishing economy. More entrepreneurs and all of that. I mean, it was quite interesting his comments on stamp duty and cuts in VAT. He was saying that these will have a big boon to the economy. Well, if that's the case, why do they not make these permanent? Why haven't they done them before? I mean, why have we got these taxes in the first place?
Right. So it's really interesting you say that. So obviously TPA has been doing some really good work, putting forward quite granular proposals for which particular taxes you need to reduce at a time like this in order to get through the emergency, and particularly cutting the cost of hiring people and the cost of investment. So stamp duty, national insurance, capital gains tax would be the biggie, probably the most unpopular, the most controversial politically, but probably the best in terms of the impact of encouraging businesses to invest. And then, yeah, sure, corporation tax, VAT. I mean, there's a number of things you can do that will encourage businesses to keep growing. Here's the thing. There's fiscal loosening that takes the form of spending, and there's fiscal loosening that takes the form of tax cuts and allowing people to spend more. Why does the second work better than the first? For the most basic and obvious of reasons. People will spend their money more wisely than a committee of bureaucrats will spend it for them, even if that committee is made up of the best and wisest and most disinterested people in the world, right? They are not superhuman, and they can't fail to have some unintended consequences and some errors at the margin. And so if there is a case for a one-off fiscal loosening in the aftermath of this quite extraordinary event, it should be in the direction of cutting taxes. And that will mean accepting the basic truth that the role of the politician is not to create jobs, is not to sustain jobs, it's to remove obstacles so that businesses can grow and hire more people. And that was why, following Margaret Thatcher, Britain had better structural employment than almost anywhere in Europe, precisely because we understood that the role of the government was to shift the rocks and to let the grass grow, to allow businesses to grow themselves. And it's depressing how rarely you hear anyone prepared to make that argument today. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, despite all that, despite the tax burden being at a 50-year high, despite the wasteful spending, I mean, you were talking there about, the best and brightest minds will still sort of make mistakes. And indeed, we still have HS2, which completely baffles me, and probably now on course to cost 150, maybe even 200 billion pounds. Despite all those negativities, are you optimistic about the future of the UK economy? Well, in the very long run, yes, because entrepreneurs are always smarter than regulators, and I have huge faith in the innovative genius of the British people. I think we're an unusually inventive nation, and we have been down the ages. But in the short term, I'm pretty gloomy. I'm gloomy. A lot of people have been making parallels with the Second World War during this coronavirus thing, and you've got to be careful with those. They can be inexact. But there's one way in which I think the parallel works strongly, and it's this. In 1945, people had become habituated to a much larger role for the state than would have seemed possible in 1940. And people came to expect government intrusions, indeed to demand them, in a way that didn't happen, if you like, in the other Anglosphere countries that were not so heavily impacted by the full mobilization. And a consequence of that is that powers that the state had seized on a supposedly contingent emergency basis to defeat the Nazis ended up not being handed back when the emergency had passed. So we had identity cards until 1952, food rationing until 1954, full military conscription until 1960. And then when it came to the economic controls that had been put in place in the first half of the 1940s, they were in place in most cases until the 1980s. In some cases, they're still with us, right? That's the really dangerous parallel, that people are now expecting a much stronger role for the state going forward. And it wasn't just the Second World War that bankrupted us. It was the insistence on maintaining it afterwards. Now, let's admit, we free market, limited government types, I hope we're practical, I hope we're fair-minded. We're not, we try not to approach things dogmatically, but to say what needs to be done. And I think almost all my libertarian friends accepted, after the epidemic broke out, that there needed to be some things that we wouldn't normally countenance. In particular, we accepted that if the government was closing down businesses by saying you're not allowed to open a pub or a gym or a cinema, those enterprises, if they were otherwise healthy, had a moral case to compensation, and there was a pretty good practical case for saying keeping them going. I get all of that. But look at how the government how the argument, let's say, is now morphing into, well, shouldn't we support businesses that are technically allowed to reopen, but that are not going to get much custom now because of fears about the virus? Or what about, charities? Shouldn't we have to step in and rescue them? Now, those arguments then risk becoming open-ended. And look, in a perfect world, of course, we'd support all of these things. If I had a magic wand, who wouldn't? But the reality is we've taken on more debt than we've ever done in an equivalent period. And there is simply not the money to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I was on radio the other day talking about taxpayer-funded bicycle lessons for adults. It's exactly the same point you made. If we had loads of money, yeah, fine, but we just don't. It's opportunity cost. But one positive I think that maybe will come out of this, and you wrote about it just the other day, is are we finally getting away from this ridiculous idea of 50% of people need to go to university? A lot of people go to university, end up coming out not getting the job they expected to, often on a much lower salary. Could this be a better, boon for jobs?
I think we are plainly witnessing a market failure in the sense that a university graduate 5 years on is earning less than somebody with higher technical skills. So if you do, an HNC or HND, you get a basic hands-on 1 or 2 year qualification in electrical engineering, accountancy, photography, whatever it is. You're actually earning more. It's not just that you've spent less and you didn't have to take 3 years out and you've got all the debt to pay. You're actually earning more than the average holder of a BA degree. And so that suggests that something is going wrong. Now, it would be quite wrong to say the 50% target was wrong, so let's replace it with a 20% target, right? The point is, we shouldn't have targets, when we shouldn't be like an old Comic-Con state saying, this is going to be our target for machine tool production this year, this is our quota for tractors, right? You should let the market decide. And in general, people are, 17, 18-year-olds are pretty savvy consumers, and there will be plenty of demand for tertiary education institutions that are geared to local and regional employer demand, right? People are well capable of making that trade-off. I really think the current system, it's hurting lots of people. It's not great for the taxpayer. It's very bad news for a lot of graduates who end up being ripped off, frankly. They end up with degrees that they'll never recoup the cost of, and often they end up defaulting on their loans. But it's also very bad news for our economy as a whole. And because, we've got huge shortages of plumbing engineers or whatever, and huge oversupplies of sociology graduates. And there's also what I think of as a sort of Peter Thiel argument, which is a lot of people are being taken out of productive work at the moment in their life when they're at their most inventive and at their most likely to have brilliant new ideas. I'm reading at the moment Matt Ridley's book on innovation, which is a great book, by the way. I strongly recommend it. Strongly recommend having him on, if you haven't already, in one of these podcasts. Brilliant, brilliant mind. And one of the things that comes through, he goes through looking at innovation in energy, in food, and so on. One of the things that comes through is how much innovation is driven by people without much formal education. You know, certainly the Industrial Revolution in this country was largely made by men who left school in their mid-teens because they wanted to get into a workshop and start tinkering. And I wonder, it's a question that's almost never asked, but I wonder what is, if you like, the opportunity cost of taking those kids out of a place where they could be doing some work as well as getting a qualification and putting them in a lecture hall where they're only doing academic subjects.
Yeah, definitely. I think Michael Faraday is a good example of you know, the inventor of electricity or something. Or
almost all of them. Arkwright,
yeah.
Bolt, Watt. I mean, you know, it's very striking when you read their letters. A lot of them were, you know, were very shaky spellers, right? These were not men who showed any sign of great formal education in their writing. They were all very savvy when it came to establishing their intellectual property rights, but that was savviness rather than book learning. And I just wonder, you know, I had the great pleasure not long ago of visiting a school that JCB had established to teach people engineering. And not all of the kids were becoming engineers, but they had the most unbelievably successful stats of how many of them were employed and what were they earning 2 years on. And it was because the whole way of teaching them was hands-on, and a lot of it was done on the job. And that suits an awful lot of people who are, I think, being shortchanged by the current focus on paper qualifications in academic subjects. And not, you know, not every local university needs to, it's almost as though they feel honor bound to offer sort of MAs in every humanities subject, otherwise people won't take them seriously. They don't need to do that. They'd be doing themselves and their students a favor if they thought more in terms of who are the employers in this town and what are they interested in, and what skills, not particularly technical skills that may soon become redundant, but what habit of thinking and what approach to problem solving is going to give people long-term employability. And
they charge them the full £9,000 or £12,000 or whatever it is now for, as you say, for a bit of a meaning course. Completely agree with your points on JCB. There's a similar thing going on at Stansted Airport where they are literally teaching, I don't know, 16 to 19-year-olds everything from jet engine maintenance to you know, food preparation for flights. And I remember speaking to the kids and I said, how many of you are going to go to university? And they said, I think 1 out of about 20 put their hands up. And what was very clever was they work shift work, like you know, people in the workplace. It was absolutely brilliant. Anyway, we must move on from that because I want to talk finally about the state of the Labour Party at the moment, and indeed the Conservative Party, because at last year's Conservative conference you were on a panel discussing socialism at a Taxpayer Alliance event, and that was back when a Corbyn government was, I think it's fair to say, a possibility, possibly well, for a lot of people, a very worrying possibility. Now under Keir Starmer, it sort of seems like, you know, the other day they were sort of toying with a wealth tax, but then they very much stamped that out straight away. You know, after the budget, they seem to be calling the Conservatives out for wasteful spending. You know, you don't hear that phrase borrow to invest as much anymore. That seems to have disappeared. Do you think that they realise that they finally realised their socialist policies don't work, and you know, they're sort of building on what the Tories did. They're trying to establish themselves as the party of fiscal responsibility. And there's a bit of a long-winded question, but with that in mind, can they win the next election? Well, you know, now that I'm no longer a politician, let me say something that I hope I'd have had the courage to say when I was still an elected Conservative, which is I really hope so, right? Because this country needs a decent, credible opposition. Every government does better when it is looking across the chamber at another potential government, right? It's what keeps you on your toes. It's what raises your game. And the collapse of the Labour Party was not in the long-term interest of the Conservative Party. There needs to be it may not be the Labour Party, but there needs to be an alternative on the left that people can take seriously in order for the Tory Party to do its best. Again, you know, this may sound odd coming from a Conservative, but I really lamented what had happened to Labour under Corbyn.
we've been luckier than a lot of countries in the temper of our left of centre party. You don't have to look very far to see socialist parties that were born in bloodshed and revolution, and where the revolution would only be complete when we'd strangled the last king with the bowels of the last priest, and that was not our tradition. Our main left-wing party was born in working men's libraries and brass bands and nonconformist churches and the temperance movement, and it was much more focused on building people up. And the proudest achievements of the British left down the years have been when it's taken power from elites and dispersed it more widely, whether in terms of a wider franchise, more meritocracy, whatever it is, more access to education. That was not Corbyn's tradition. Corbyn was coming from a pure revolutionary Marxist analysis, tearing things down, starting again. And I think a lot of decent patriotic people who'd voted Labour really felt it. I mean, I had a number of Labour MEP friends, and it was impossible for your heart not to go out to them. These guys who, obviously, we disagreed about loads and loads of things, not just about Europe, but they were in politics from fundamentally good motives. They thought they were serving their community. They were doing their best. And they were suddenly turning up to CLP meetings and being howled down as traitors by people who'd only arrived 5 minutes before. And that was not a healthy situation for anyone to be in. So if the Labour Party makes itself credible by accepting that you have to earn what you spend, that there isn't some magic money tree, that wanting your country to do well is not a sort of colonialist or racist or fascist, there's still plenty of scope for it to be a party of the left. But if it accepts, if you like, where the parameters drawn by the majority of the electorate are, that can only be good news for them and therefore for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose you could argue that, you've got Labour coming back towards the centre ground, but the Tories are also sort of coming towards the centre ground in a way as well, depending on how you look at it. I mean, do you think that was a sort of a victory of Corbyn in a way, is that he dragged the Conservatives towards the left, and now we've sort of entered this, almost no man's land where, yes, the Tories have had some tax cuts recently, but it's almost taken the coronavirus crisis to bring that about, if you see what I mean. They're still not cutting income tax.
That's it. It's a good question, Harry. It's a really interesting point. So I'm not sure that's, I mean, you certainly that is what happened to the Labour Party in the late Thatcher era, right? Eventually, first under John Smith and then much more under Tony Blair, the Labour Party had to accept that a lot of its most cherished ideals were just not electable, and it had to move and to shift to where Margaret Thatcher had dragged the common ground. I'm not sure there has been a reverse. I think the extraordinary opening of the spigots occasioned by the coronavirus is such a one-off event. It's not really to do with Corbyn or Starmer or indeed any, Boris or any other leader. The problem is a much more simple one. It's that spinning the taps open is much easier than screwing them shut again. When you've watched hundreds of billions of pounds gurgling down the plug on, quantitative easing, furlough payments, and so on, it becomes almost impossible to argue against spending another 30 million on free school meals or whatever. I mean, in the scheme of things, that's then a rounding error. Yeah. And so every time you give in, it becomes harder to give in the next time. And that's the danger we're now in, that we will end up in an avalanche of demands for more spending. And there's a funny thing that happens about all of this, which is that the vocabulary that people use, even conservatives, that, that it's generous if you're for spending, and it's mean or it's selfish or it's stingy if you're against, as though the politician were talking about his own money, right, rather than about the taxpayers' money. And this is the fundamental flaw in all the coverage. That you can agree or disagree with individual proposals to spend more, but the politician who's arguing against spending is being the opposite of selfish, because that politician is standing up for the interests of taxpayers who will never thank him, taxpayers in some cases who aren't yet born, because that politician believes that he or she is doing the right thing. And so even when you think that they've made the wrong call, for heaven's sake, can we grow up and not call it stingy or selfish?
Indeed. So with that in mind, do you think it's tax cuts or pledges to spend more money that will now win elections?
Well, look, if you ask people in the abstract, of course, they'll always favour both of those things, but they will prefer the spending of more money because it's easier to conceptualise. It's easier to visualise somebody giving you a slug of cash. But politics doesn't work like that. You know, if you ask people in isolation about one aspect of economic policy, the answer is often pretty hair-raising. You know, my favorite example of this is, and it's a regular thing that happens every few years, when companies will poll the question, should it be illegal for travel agents and airlines to put their prices up during school holidays? And everyone goes, oh, yeah, you know, showing them the most total lack of interest in any concept of supply and demand, or even the most basic, you know. But the point is, we don't run an economy as a series of opinion poll questions. You have to vote for the team with an overall plan that you regard as credible, right? And in the end, people did not regard a litany of spending promises by Corbyn as credible. They smelt a rat, right? And people can be quite mature about this. I think that the next election, certainly the next couple of years, is going to be dominated by the question of unemployment in a way that we've forgotten, right? Or that you lucky young people won't remember, and the people of my age are just about old enough to remember. The way in which the unemployment rate in the early 80s was not just the key political fact, but the key cultural fact. It was, you know, it was the theme of TV and films and chart-topping singles. And yet, with unemployment above 3 million, Margaret Thatcher won big in 1983, and unemployment just below 3 million won big again in 1987, because people trusted her to have a long-term economic plan, which she did, right? So people understood her argument of, if you like, kind of, I don't know how to put it, deferred gratification, maybe, that, yeah, this is going to be painful, every country is going to have to do this, we're going to get it out of the way, and then there's sunshine on the other side. And there was, right? We've had structurally very, very low unemployment since the early 90s, with only the blip of the financial crash, because we got the structures in place and people trust. So people are capable of voting in the round for a fiscally conservative package, but you know, only if you're prepared to make the argument courageously and not to make policy by opinion poll, because you know we're all inconsistent, and voters are particularly inconsistent when they say that they want more money and more tax rises, more tax cuts, and all the rest of it. So you've got to offer a coherent platform.
Well, that gives me hope for the future that some TPA policies will be adopted. Dan, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for coming on TPA Talks. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Harry. It's been a great pleasure for me, and thank you to everyone listening, particularly to those of you who support the TPA. We really do need to win the argument now that people are the best custodians of their own cash.
Our thanks to Dan Hannan. This has been another edition of TPA Talks, and we'll see you all again shortly for the next one. Thank you.